Okay, deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Mike and Natalie videos. Adrian says, watching Mike is so triggering for me. Reminds me of my family and trying to search for intimacy and feeling like I never get through and no one acknowledges my feelings or my hurt. Always falling on my own sword, as it were. Yes, it can be very, very hurtful to be around people who will not acknowledge feelings, will avoid their own feelings. Usually they're coming from a place of trauma themselves, but it doesn't lessen the hurt that it causes on other people. Joy says, emotionally, it gets dangerous to give a partner like Natalie personal, intimate information because she is the type that will weaponize it and use it against you and use it to dig at to hurt you. Yes, so we've seen that before. We haven't seen it recently, but Natalie does seem to do that. And you could say that the whole fight was about that in that moment, Natalie felt hurt that Mike had said, you know, the reason why my friends don't like you sometimes is because you can be really harsh. She was hurt by that. And instead of just saying, hey, that hurt my feelings, or defending herself in a way that wasn't dysfunctional, she instantly finds some detail that she knows will be a good jab to the heart, and she says it. Now, does that justify Mike getting up and abandoning her in the hotel? I guess you can use your own judgment on that. Irina says, the Mike and Natalie videos make me so sad because the more I watch them, the more I realize I'm engaged to a Mike. Sad face. I know my fiance is very insecure about being rejected, but always extending himself and getting nothing back is what will possibly make me reject him. Yes, so this is the tragedy of these kinds of relational traumas, is that when you are traumatized this way and you learn to be vague and to not acknowledge your own feelings, not even necessarily be aware of your own feelings, not acknowledge other people's feelings, always try to come out on top of arguments that you're trying to protect yourself from being hurt in the past, that it actually pushes people away, and then you perpetually are being rejected by other people, compounding the rejection you experience in your early childhood. So the older you get, you just are building a catalog of rejections, causing more reason to be defensive and avoidant and vague in relationships. And although we might be able to see that, like Irina is seeing that, it's like, I think my fiance is like that. We might be able to conceptualize that, but it doesn't reduce the hurt, and it might not reduce the motivation to consider whether or not the relationship is what's best for you. Joe, now therapy, couples therapy, individual therapy is the way to go, but you can't make a horse drink from the water. Is that how it goes? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can suggest someone go to therapy for the betterment of themselves and the relationship, but they need to go themselves, and they also need to meaningfully participate, and they have to acknowledge that they have an issue. Joanna says, Mike is wearing Natalie down. She has to do all the emotional work in the relationship. I'm exhausted just watching it. Yeah, Joanna, I think a lot of people are exhausted watching Mike and Natalie for sure. Kalani and Asuelu videos from last week. Mia says, I grew up in a Samoan church and half of my family is Samoan. This straightforward, blunt communication that they are doing about money, I have never witnessed before. There is an emphasis on giving back to people back home. Samoans are generally very warm, welcoming, affectionate, and community-oriented. It's so sad to see a beautiful, underrepresented culture portrayed by these families. Right. So as I often am asking is, please comment about any cultural elements that are at play in these videos that I'm watching. Helps me, and it also helps the viewers to learn about different cultures, and so that we can interpret things and not misinterpret things. And so with Asuelu's parents, with the mom and the sister, they're being extremely blunt and straightforward and hostile and aggressive, literally wanting to fight Kalani because of, give me money, give me $1,000 a month. And so on one hand, people are saying, look, in Samoan culture, it is quite normal to share with your parents with what, there's a very community-oriented, warm, welcoming, affectionate, giving, sharing, wonderful culture that really is superior to American mainstream culture in those ways, for sure. I mean, Americans they don't share very well. The example that I always come up with, and maybe I said it in the video, is imagine you live in an apartment building and there are 10 apartments on your floor, and you know some of the neighbors. And one person steps forward and says, hey, how about we just have 2 vacuum cleaners and we share the vacuum cleaner? We put it in this little closet in the hallway and we just share a vacuum cleaner. Americans will never go for that. Maybe some will out of desperation, but culturally speaking wise, it's really, really uncool to do that. It's a disgrace on yourself if you have a community bathroom or a community kitchen or a community vacuum cleaner or community car or something. We're so materialistic that we all have to have our own vacuum cleaner, even when it is illogical to think that way. Now, again, some people don't operate that way, but my perception of mainstream culture is that way. Anyway, so Samoan culture, Mia is saying, is a beautiful culture that is underrepresented in the media, and they are being represented now on this show by a mom and a sister that are acting in a very strange way to Samoan people. Sophia says, I think kissing, remember the episode with Asuelu and his mom kissing, I think kissing is a common gesture to greet people in many different cultures. I can see why people think it's odd, but it's just a respectful gesture in many cultures. Agreed. Not in the United States, because we are we're in the top 5 most, if not the most, touch-phobic societies. And Americans tend to think that our culture is correct, and so our interpretations are truth, instead of wondering, I wonder if they have it right and we have it wrong. Yulia says, I felt so bad for Asuelu in this moment. He seems to desperately want to please and protect his mother, at the same time getting ridiculed by Kalani for his feelings. It's almost as if they've been ostracized by others as a family, the Asuelu's family, which is easy to imagine given the mom's behavior, and Asuelu feels hurt and defensive. I'm not saying Asuelu is a good husband. I just feel bad for him. Yes, agreed. Shay says, I think Kalani was just busting his balls about the kiss. But every family is different with how they show affection, even if it seems odd to some. Well, Shay, I don't know what you exactly mean by busting his balls. People mean different sort of things. I think what you mean is playful making fun of, affectionately making fun of someone. You know, I trip and, well, actually, so one time I was going to back when, before the lockdown, I was going to a theater and I had, I'd gotten my big tub of, half of the reason why I'd go to movies in the movie theater was getting the popcorn. And so I have this big, huge tub of popcorn and I'm going to chow down on it while I'm watching some movie. And I'm going to a movie theater that's really old in Seattle, and it's never been renovated, and the seats are, not so great. And some of them are broken. I didn't know that. And on this seat, I sit down in the seat. And I also kind of like to sit towards the front because I like to be fully encompassed by the screen. So I walk down the long aisle, big theater, lots of people behind me, and I'm, before the movie, and I'm walking into the aisle, and again, I had this big, I probably have a drink in my, giant drink as well. And I'm sitting down, and the seat just completely snaps, just goes crack. And as a reflex, I'm trying not to fall down, and I throw the popcorn. I just I think I held onto the bucket, but I went like this. And if you have an overflowing thing of popcorn and you do this, the popcorn is, it's like confetti, and it just like a mushroom cloud of popcorn went everywhere. And the entire crowd of people busted up laughing at me, and I was like, oh, womp womp. And I had to go back, and fill the popcorn. But anyway, so I come home and I tell my wife about this, and every time we see popcorn, she makes fun of me for this. So that is busting my balls, which is welcomed by me. I mean, it's, it's not an enjoyable memory for me, but it is, when she makes fun of me, we're laughing with each other, not her laughing at me. When Kalani was doing that to Asuelu, it didn't seem like they were laughing together. It didn't seem like she was intending on having it being a together laugh. it looked like she was making fun of him and ridiculing him, which is not cool. Even if Asuelu is a bad husband, even a bad person, it doesn't justify that kind of behavior. Crystal says, I'm not a fan of Asuelu, but it was so freaking cute watching how he was about the food trucks, LOL. Right. So if you remember Asuelu saying, the best of the best, that was very cute. All right, Elizabeth and Andre videos. Patricia says, this is how my dad is, and it's the worst. Any correction is taken as you're wrong and stupid. He thinks apologizing means you're letting the other person win. Right. So Andre, I think Patricia is referring to Andre, has a really hard time apologizing, and so does Chuck, and so does Charlie. Lisa says, I don't know about the rest of you, but this show becomes so much more enjoyable for me when seen through Dr. Honda's lens. Is that true, Lisa? That's actually one of the things I worry about, that I'm ruining the show for everyone by talking about the things that I talk about, by reacting the way I react. I sometimes wonder, am I ruining the show? Because I get the feeling like some people just watch it because they like to yell at people on the screen, and I don't typically do that. But anyway, I'm glad, Lisa, that it doesn't ruin the show for you. That makes me happy. Feisty says, the way to apologize would make a great T-shirt. So, I'm frequently talking about the tenets of a good apology, and that would make a good T-shirt. That really would. Speaking of T-shirts, there's this one that's been out for a while. Don't be a jerk face. The Podwife designed this one. You can get it in various colors, but I think yellow, really kind of accentuates the mood of the shirt. Olivia says, I'm glad Kirk is talking about this. My dad is someone who can't say sorry like the Fonz, and I have followed in his footsteps. I can say sorry, but it feels awful because it feels like admitting I'm a terrible person, and I feel a hell of a lot of self-loathing and guilt. Yes, Olivia, thank you for sharing that, because when we see someone on the show, which is frequent, having a really hard time apologizing, it's easy to look at that person and say they're a jerk face, and they're choosing to do this just because they're selfish, and malignant narcissism, this thing you'll see on the internet. And it's usually not the case. Usually what it is a lot of traumas or modeling that happened when we were growing up that result in an ongoing sense of self-loathing, and to apologize just compounds it. Imagine if all day you're like, inside, you're like, I hate myself. I'm not a good person. I'm not worthy. Everyone else seems to be doing great. I'm doing terribly. Look at all the success everyone is having. I'm constantly making a mistake. And internally, you're just apologizing all the time. You're just like, I'm just so sorry that I exist. I'm sorry that I do these things. I'm sorry I'm a failure. I'm sorry that I'm such a loser. And so I am a loser, and I'm sorry. And this is internally what's happening all the time. And then someone comes along and alerts you that you made a mistake. It's just too much to handle, because the amount of self-shame and the amount of self-apologizing that someone is doing makes it's like, I can't do it again. I can't. To admit to myself is one thing, but to admit to other people, it's just too much. I can't handle that much self-loathing, and then that causes the person to not want to apologize to anyone because it's overwhelming to them. But what ends up happening is that pushes people away and causes you to feel even more like you're worthless, even more like you hate yourself, because look at me. Once again, everyone's running away from me. I can't have a relationship that lasts very long. So Olivia is saying, my dad was someone who couldn't say sorry, and I am someone who also can't say sorry, probably because of the relational traumas and modeling that Olivia experienced. Because it feels like I'm admitting I'm a terrible person, and I have a lot of self-loathing and guilt. So for me, I was raised pretty well and have had a lot of therapy. And so when I apologize for something, it doesn't hurt me that much because I have a lot of self-esteem, because I have had a lot of people love me, and I've had a lot of examples in relationships that have taught me through my entire life that I am, mostly good with some negative qualities. Mostly good, but definitely some negative qualities to my personality. And so when I apologize, I stand on that foundation of, well, yeah, I did something wrong, but this is just that's the exception to the rule. The rule is that I'm a generally good person and I try. And if you don't have those wonderful experiences and love and a lot of people giving you respect and telling you that you're worthy and showing you that you're worthy, you don't believe you're worthy, and then it's so hard to apologize, because to apologize means you have to admit that there's something wrong with you, and sometimes you just can't do that. It's just too much to ask. And it will feel like it's acknowledging verbally and outwardly that, yes, I am a terrible person, even though that's not actually what's happening. What you're really doing is you're just saying, look, I'm sorry for that one behavior. I'm not sorry for me as a human being. I'm sorry for that one behavior, but for some people, it's really hard for them. By the way, Olivia, I mentioned the Fonz. You mentioned the Fonz, because the Fonz on happy days could, old people like us watch that show. I actually bought a Happy Days lunchbox for my back wall there. While I'm on the topic, I also have other swag or merch here. My cat wants to chime in. This is my cat, Michelle, that would chime in, and she passed away about a month ago, as a lot of you know. So this is in honor to her. I also got a few other things. During the lockdown, which we kind of still are in, right? I have been essentially just buying a lot of things on eBay that make me happy. I'll just be like, let's just go on eBay, and I want that thing. Well, I bought this because I love The Office, and I love Parks and Rec. So I got a Leslie Knope, employee badge. I also want to promote a book that doesn't need promotion because he's very famous, which is John Green, the Anthropocene Reviewed. He's the author of the book that led to the movie Fault in My Stars. You might remember him from that. But he's a wonderful person, wonderful author, and he has a wonderful podcast called the Anthropocene Reviewed. And he made a book from the podcast. The podcast is probably my favorite podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts, by the way. I listen to hours and hours every day. I have been even before, the reason why I started this podcast 13 years ago is because I listened to so many podcasts 15 years ago. But anyway, this beautiful book. And I have a signed copy. So neener. Nix says, I literally choked when Chuck said, we Americans treat people with respect who are guests in our country. Right. Yeah, when Chuck said, we Americans treat people with respect in our country. Like, what? Is this like opposite world? Julie said, we Americans don't even respect subset cultures within America. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Maria says, my grandparents were engineers when they were in the Soviet Union. My grandma was the valedictorian at her university. After immigrating to the United States, they had to become janitors. Right. This is a good point that I think most people, hopefully a lot of people understand, that when you immigrate, it sometimes results in whatever sort of qualifications for a job that you had prior to moving are just erased for various different reasons, racism being one of them. And this show often doesn't acknowledge that. Good old Stella Annie says, Andre said he left Moldova to escape the corrupt police. I feel so bad for him that he not only had to go through that, but on top of that, he's being grilled about it by Elizabeth's family. Libby's family is such a nightmare. Yeah. LR says, Dr. Honda actually snort laughed at the tough guy brother, LOL. Did I snort laugh? Yeah, there's some high comedy in that storyline. Helen says, there is a strange sense of comfort when Dr. Honda starts chuckling at Charlie. Yeah. Has anyone watched Eastbound and Down? It has that kind of look to it and feel to it. It's almost like a parody of that type of human. Bruna says, another video from Bruna says, another video from our psychology daddy. Am I your psychology daddy? I should probably snort laugh to that. Yeah, I see people comment like that sometimes, that I'm the internet father, or I'm the YouTube dad or something, which I welcome, I suppose, if it's and said in a warm way, in a non-creepy way. When you have a dad that loves you and cares about you and has your best interests in heart and is maybe a little bit beyond the trappings of youth, like getting worked up about certain things. And, one of the things I remember that I always loved and still do about my dad is, I'll never forget, I would have been a teenager or something. We were probably watching the Seahawks, the American football team here in Seattle, and something bad's happening, and I'm screaming. I'm like, Jim Zorn, you idiot, or Dave Craig fumbled again, or whatever it is that I'm screaming. And I'm just totally down on our team. I'm like, you guys terrible. And my dad would say something like, well, you win some, you lose. And he was into it just as much as I was. But at the same time, he could kind of empathize, I guess, with the players. And so if that's the kind of dad vibe I give, then I welcome that. Alice says, and by the way, I'm so old, I could be some of your grandfathers, I suppose. Maybe in a little bit, I'll be a psychology grandfather. I don't know about the word daddy, though. Let's move on. Alice says, I'm just wondering if the rebel in Libby is being with a man and her family won't get along. I'm just wondering if the rebel in Libby is being with a man her family won't get along with. Alice, that's very perceptive. I wonder if that is a part of it. Feisty says, the dad and brother are pretty scary characters to me. I don't often encounter people with such toxic masculinity, but I'm not sure Andre would feel safe making himself vulnerable to these guys. Yeah, it's an interesting point. All right, Big Ed videos. I've been starting to watch The Single Life, which a lot of you have been asking me to watch for a while. And I didn't know if that show would have much to comment on, but there does seem to be things to comment on. Anka says, my impression is that Big Ed seems to be focused primarily on physical aspects of women and how they can satisfy his needs. Yeah. Ida says, I would think that Ed's biggest lesson he should have learned from dating Rose was to stop lying. He lied about a lot of things, and that was one of the main reasons why she broke up with him. Agreed. But the underlying reasons, relational trauma-wise, as to why he would lie in the first place to Rose have not washed away miraculously. Without therapy, with a lot of healing, a lot of introspection, his personality does span, many relationships, probably going back decades. Carria says, the way that Big Ed says he wants someone to take care of and spoil sounds like he wants a puppy, not a girlfriend, LOL. Yeah. Adrian says, I've heard people say that they want to take care of or spoil someone, but it always seems to have a hidden agenda of control. Yes, often that is the case, and I think I talked about that. And why do people have an agenda of control? Well, it's usually because of their relational traumas have led them to believe falsely that they need to control in order to retain attachments. Authentistic says, thank you for addressing the bootstrap theory of self-esteem. Many well-meaning people have tried to convince me to just pull up my self-esteem by the bootstraps, and I have sincerely taken on that challenge only to fail over and over. This has set back my self-esteem even more because I feel even worse about myself after failing. So many years wasted on this conundrum. Yes, Authentistic, it is a very American idea that we need to do things on your own. A similar thing that I hear, and it means various different things, but people will say, you can't love another person until you love yourself. What I would say more accurately is it's hard to love another person in a natural, healthy way until you are loved enough. We always turn to this solution of, well, you got to work on yourself first. Well, what does that mean exactly, working on yourself? And certainly that can mean a lot of healthy things, but often it's this message of isolate yourself and figure your crap out before you bother other people with your crap. But our crap usually is is a result of the way we were being treated, neglected, or abused at varying different degrees. And the way out of that isn't to isolate further. The way out of that is through secure relationships. And self-esteem is the same way. People will say, like, you just have to believe in yourself. You just have to have good self-esteem. If it was that easy, no one would have low self-esteem. Like, let's think outside the box here, people. And there are, very legitimate reasons why people have low self-esteem, because they're treated like crap their entire life. And they now believe that they are crap because we believe the way we are treated. We see ourselves the way other people see us. And this American idea of just being independent, like, I don't care. Whenever anyone says, like, I don't care what other people think, those people really care about what other people think. That's why they're saying, I don't care what other people think, because they don't want other people to think that they really do care about what other people think. And they say, I don't care, because they don't want to alert other people to the fact that they really deeply care. So that's a human fact. And us Americans like to deny that, and it just compounds the problem. Welcome to Plathville episodes. Carolyn says, my parents' motivation, the parents' motivation for asking Micah and Mariah to move out was to protect the younger kids from the seeds of rebellion, not to do what was best for Micah and Mariah. Yeah, it seems like that was a part of it. Again, as with the control, why would the parents want to control that? Why do they want to keep the younger kids away from the negative influences? Well, I think it's because the parents have been deeply traumatized, at least the mom has, and the solution to trying to raise kids who aren't, the mom wants to, in a good altruistic way, she wants to raise children who won't go through what she went through when she was growing up. And her solution might be overshooting the mark, overcompensating, and actually creating a similar problem for the children. This is a common thing that parents will do when they're traumatized without a lot of therapy or self-reflection. One example that I often will say is, say you're raised by an alcoholic parent and they are drunk often, they are absent emotionally, they're absent from the house, they break a lot of promises, and then you grow up and you say, I'm never drinking, particularly around my kids. Once I have kids, no drinking for me. I'm going to be responsible. And, my father was a deadbeat dad who was drinking all the time, and he never had money and he could never pay the bills. I'm going to be responsible. I'm going to have a good job. I'm going to pay the bills. And then as the parent moves forward, they end up working so much because they're desperate to show to their kids that they're responsible, that they work too much, and they become a workaholic. And in turn, they are neglecting their children. Both, children scenarios where whether you have an alcoholic parent or a workaholic parent feel neglected and rejected, even though the child of the alcoholic who is raising their own children thinks they are compensating when they are actually overcompensating. Sarah says, fundamentalism is so damaging for children, even with caring parents, because they are parented from a place of fear. I am so proud of Mariah for being strong in her convictions in a healthy way and thriving. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that, Sarah, but that makes a lot of sense. That fundamentalism, it's hard to generalize completely. And what do we mean by fundamentalism? But we certainly can look at this family and wonder if the fundamentalist dogma and practices and the belief system is actually motivated by fear. And there's a lot of messages of fear, a lot of, who knows, but a lot of messages of, if you become like everyone else and live a worldly life, even if you're like other Christians, like Olivia, for example, then you are absolutely going to burn in hell. And we know that there are ideologies out there like this. And when, as a child, you're hearing, and some of you might be able to relate to this, when you grow up in a fundamentalist, or at least in that direction sort of family, or even not even necessarily fundamentalist, if you grow up in a belief system in a family that involves a lot of terror, meaning you better do this or else you're going to die. And we might even extend it to situations where it's legitimate. So whether it's legitimate or not, a made-up dogma, or you're living in a war zone, and as a child, your parents are giving you all the, or, as another example, you are a black family in the United States, and your parents are telling you, as a kid, you're a young black man, or a black teenager, and your parents are telling you, you got to watch out. The cops could shoot you. The community could discriminate against you. There's a lot of danger out there, and I care about you and love you, son, and I want you to know that the danger's out. So for legitimate sources of fear and for dogmatic, illegitimate, made-up sources of fear, for the child, that is very difficult, obviously, to grow up in that state of fear. When I was a kid, the fear was the USSR invading or nuclear war. Those were big biggies. I remember as a kid, it was just an assumption that World War III was going to involve a nuclear winter and that 90% of the humans on the planet would die. It was just like, of course, it just has to happen. We had World War I, we had World War II. There's going to be World War III, and no one's going to pull any punches in that war, and we're just going to obliterate the human race. And as a kid, that was pretty frightening. And we didn't, that didn't end up happening. And I imagine to young people today, that might seem kind of quaint, like, well, why'd you worry about that? Well, it was a legit fear. In the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan was calling the USSR, I can't remember, the evil empire or something. It was a real threat. Even before I was born, we had the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was real incidents of almost going full nuclear exchange from USSR and the United States. And anyway, my point is that fear, whether it's legit or not, has a huge toll on children, causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of demoralization, a lot of staring into the darkness at night, wondering about various different things. Kids have a hard time dealing with that. They don't have the tools to know their emotions, reach out for help, and will just stew in those emotions. And that's why we have to help our kids with that. We have to maybe shelter them age appropriately. And also we have to talk with them about emotional regulation, help them walk through the emotions, Like for me, if someone, and maybe they did, it's a long time ago, would have come to me and said, so, do you know about the possibility of a nuclear war? And I'd be like, yeah, I'm worried about that. And they say, well, how do we work on that? What do we do with that? What do you feel? What's the emotion you feel? The model that I propose to clients is that you spend a lot of time getting to know the emotion. So you talk with the 10-year-old boy and you say, well, I'm very afraid that all of us are going to die and I'm not going to be able to grow old and have a good life, or I'll survive and it'll be this terrible wasteland and I'll be scavenging for food. And you say, okay, well, and you feel fear, and how often do you feel it? Well, I feel it like once a day, especially when I lay down at night to go to bed. Okay, so what do we do with that feeling? Because that feeling is fine. The feeling is okay. Feeling is just a normal part of life. What do we, how do we evaluate it? Is this a rational fear or is it irrational? And that's the first question we ask. And we might conclude that it actually is rational to worry about that in 1980 or 1981. Then we ask her, because if it's irrational, then we can attack it. Then we can, if someone's like, well, I'm worried that aliens are going to chop my head off or something. It's like, well, that's not a rational fear. There's really not a chance of that happening. So you're watching too many movies, and so we can dispel that fear right here and now by really walking through the likelihood of that event happening. But when it comes to a nuclear holocaust, we can say, well, that could happen. Anyway, so then the next question we ask is it helpful or unhelpful to think about it? Or how much thinking about it would be helpful? So we would evaluate that question, and we might conclude to the 10-year-old boy that there's really no helpfulness to thinking about it. Now, that doesn't mean we can get rid of our feelings, because that's further down the line, but we just need to ask ourselves that question, because for some worries, it actually is helpful to worry about. Like, say your child has a diagnosis of cancer or something, and you're worried. So is it rational or irrational? It is a very rational fear to worry about your child if they were diagnosed with cancer. Is it helpful to worry about it? Well, there is some helpfulness to it, because it actually ramps up your attentiveness and your motivation to maybe really research it, seek out medical help and knowledge, and really reach out to your child and say, how you doing? Tell us how things are going. So some fear will motivate you to actually seek safety. That's what fear does for us. Fear motivates us to seek safety. Anger motivates us to seek justice. Sadness motivates us to seek support from other people. And so when you are afraid, what our body is trying to tell us is seek safety. Seek a safe zone so that you are no longer afraid. The problem is our brains are very good at imagining a lot of things. And so if our brains weren't as sophisticated, we could quickly hide under a rock and we would feel safe and we'd move on with our life. But our brains are very complicated. We're very good at imagining a lot of horrible things. And so the idea is that you go to 10-year-olds, say, is it rational? Yes. Is it helpful? Well, what can a 10-year-old do to, avoid that problem? Well, maybe there's something he can do. Maybe he can write a letter to the president. Maybe he can start studying politics because one day he'll be a politician and he can help with that sort of thing. Or a physicist, so he can help detect armaments and actually shoot them out of the sky. Or maybe there's something he can do with his career or with his advocacy or something. But beyond that, there's not much he can do. 99.99999% of the factors involved in the nuclear war are completely out of the 10-year-old's control, and that needs to be really internalized. And then we help the 10-year-old really understand that the worrying isn't very helpful. And so then we go to another step, which is, okay, what do I do when I feel the wave of fear? Because a lot of us just get stuck in that feeling. So what do we do with it? What do we do with the feeling? We can't let go of the feeling. We can't cope with the feeling. We have feelings, they're normal. But what do we do with it? So we could make a plan. Like, okay, every time you feel this fear at night, rattle through the 3 things that you're going to do to solve that problem, because the fear is motivating you to actually seek a solution. And so the 10-year-old says, okay, well, I'm going to write a letter to President Reagan every day and say that I want him to be extra careful and really try to make peace with the USSR. And that sense of power, and that makes us feel less afraid. I'm also going to start studying physics so that one day I can become a physicist or a mechanical engineer and I'll be able to shoot bombs out of the sky. Okay. So you're using the wave of fear is coming up, and then you have a plan. You have a thing that you're going to do. Any extra fear beyond that, we want to try to soothe ourselves about. It's just not really focus on it, because the fear has motivated us to do what we can, and any extra fear we look at as superfluous, and we look at, hey, fear, duly noted that the world could end, but I'm doing my part, and I'm doing all I can. Any extra fear, not helpful. And that might not get rid of the fear, but at least we can label it. But what most people do is they just stare into the darkness and they're just in this loop of fear. And this model applies to really everything that plagues people in an ongoing way, usually fear-based. And how did I get on this topic? I was talking about what Sarah was saying was that fundamentalism can really harm kids because of the fear. But also what I was talking about is there's legitimate fear that children will go through, like living in a racist society or in a war-torn society. Anyway, is that how I got there? All right, last comment from MJ says, welcome to Plathville video. I really, really love this series that you're doing with Plathville. It is so measured. You're so generous, kind, empathetic, and also realistic. No, thank you, MJ. I grew up in a fundamentalist homeschool home with a lot of hypocrisy and mixed messages. I'm the oldest and have really struggled as an adult to set healthy boundaries, deconstruct and reconstruct my own self-belief system, etc., while also managing the guilt about setting those boundaries with certain people in my family. These relationships are hard for me. I genuinely empathize that they've had their own traumas and difficulties that cause them to behave the way that they do. Yet they perpetuate harmful behavior and haven't taken a lot of responsibility for their decisions. The few apologies I've ever gotten were vague, I'm so sorry you feel that way, or I'm sorry but. I'm at the point where, for my own mental health, I don't feel comfortable being around them much. As the eldest daughter codependent and meshed person, it often creeps up on me and justifies the eldest daughter codependent and meshed part of me often creeps up and justifies their actions. So MJ's saying that because I was enmeshed as a child, and I was a dependent and the eldest daughter, I was trained to uphold my fundamentalist parents' ideas. And now that I'm trying to get some boundaries as an adult, sometimes that those voices creep back in and I start justifying their behavior. It's so complex, and at times it's heartbreaking. It's been a grieving process for me, and many people miss the complexity in a situation like this when they're watching this show. You handle it so graciously, so thank you. Well, you're very welcome, MJ, and thank you for sharing your story, and I'm sorry that you went through that. That is awful. It's a lifetime, as you know, of grief and of recovering from the damage that was done. And it's complicated because you have affection for those people. It's not like you just have moved on in life, like you don't love them. You can see that they're good people in some ways and that they have their traumas. It doesn't justify their behavior towards you. But you can, it's complicated, as you say, MJ. And thank you for sharing that. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.